Exoticism and Structuralism in Wallace Stevens. On the conventional periodizing account, Wallace Stevens' work, a monumental summa of the modernist languages in formation in the 1920s and 1930s, and even the immediate post-World War II era, constitutes the privileged object which a post-war ideology of modernism seeks to theorize, as well as the prototype of everything in literature with which the 1960s wished to break. Yet perhaps there were other developments in the 1960s which Stevens can be said to have anticipated. This endlessly elaborating poem displays the theory of poetry as the life of poetry. A more severe, more harassing master would extemporize subtler, more urgent proof that the theory of poetry is the theory of life. An ordinary evening in New Haven. It would be anachronistic to claim for Stevens' use of the term theory that later charged meaning with which the development of the 1960s will invest it, becoming the designation of a new form of discourse that transcends the older separations of disciplinary categories of philosophy, criticism, belles lettres, creative writing, and the like. Still, Stevens' anticipation of this term may be taken as a warning that the Stevens phenomenon may well involve some initial lifting of the old barriers between poetry and theory, and may involve the emergence of some new and, as yet, unclassifiable form of discourse. Indeed, Frank Lentrichia has pointed out that the canonization of Wallace Stevens is not merely a kind of ultimate conclusion and ending for the modernist aesthetic generally, although it is that too, and Stevens' belated triumph over all his modernist rivals, Pound, Eliot, etc., is consecrated by his institutionalization in the university as the supreme manifestation of new critical poetic and aesthetic values, not unlike the analogous revival and canonization of Henry James during the same period as the supreme exemplar of modernizing ironic narrative. But if that were all that was involved, the aforecited objections would have much merit, that Stevens' monumental work is at best to be taken as the canonical and hegemonic values of the ending 1950s, as that with which the poetry and the cultural thought of the 1960s must desperately break if it is to breathe and to make it new. Yet this is to reckon without the theoretical component of Stevens' verse. Lentrichia goes on to underscore the hegemony of Stevens as a theoretician during this period, his immense influence as a strange new type of literary critic, which is in many ways greater than that of his own prose commentators or of the founders of the new criticism. This Stevens, the theoretician of poetry rather than the poet, insofar as that distinction can be retained, will come to dominate the whole first moment of the emergent 1960s as well. And if in that case one wishes to say that what concerns us here is less the historical Wallace Stevens of the poetry than the idea of Wallace Stevens, who came to be a critical fetish in this period, then the formulation may be pragmatically acceptable, even though it neglects the diachronic transformations of Stevens' own poetry, the emergence of a seemingly distinct and more philosophical, existential late Stevens, as well as the whole nature of the dialectic itself, for which there must necessarily be a constant interaction between subject and object, between the idea of a thing and the historical thing itself. Any evaluation of Stevens' work must start from an initial axiological paradox, which is surely more intense with Stevens than with any other major modernist figure. It must somehow be able to accommodate the seeming irreconcilable impressions of an astonishing linguistic richness on the one hand, and an impoverishment or hollowness of content on the other. Each of these in constant tension with one another, and on various readings, each seeming to draw the other into its force field and transfigure it. On the one hand, a familiar modernist practice of the unique personal or private style in these poems opens up into a wealth of vocabulary and syntactical fluidity that seems both absolute, no stammering, the voice never ends, is never reduced to silence or to awkwardness, and somehow impersonal, again, as though this style were in reality something like an older rhetoric, with its collective pre-personal capacities, its pre-existing of the individual speaker, who only needs to move in it as in an element. Therewith, however, one of the key features of the modernist will to style is lost. The necessity for its violent birth, for a painful conquest of the private voice over against the universal alienation of public speech, that initial ugliness, as Gertrude Stein liked to say, which it is our business as critics to recapture, even when standing in front of the insipid canonical loveliness of the Sistine Madonna, and which is that new style's struggle to be born. Nothing of a kind in Stephens, which is to say that in him, or for his discourse, it is for whatever reason no longer necessary to posit a whole universe of degraded speech, a whole world of prose, of the world of alienation and work, of universal instrumentalization and commodification, out of which and against which a specifically disalienating poetic language will emerge. This extraordinarily supple and resourceful speech will then often seem to express its object in some remarkably apt and unmediated way. More often, however, what I have called the inner hollowness of this verse will tend to return upon its language to cast some doubt upon the latter's density and authenticity. This steals upon one in those moments in which it becomes, momentarily clear, that Stephens' only content, from the earliest masterpieces of harmonium all the way to the posthumous rock, is landscape, and that not even in the visionary sense of many of the great nature poets, for whom the momentary epiphanies of place and object world are rare events, to be preserved over against the encroaching destruction of nature, as well as the alienating features of city or man-made environment. In Stephens, nature is, however, nothing but a given, a ready-made occasion for speech. Birds, wind, mountains, the sun, always ready to hand whenever poetic speech needs some kind of objective content for its own production. This is not to say that such content in Stephens is not also historically specific, as it necessarily always must be. There must be a historical precondition even for the seemingly ahistorical availability of abstract landscape for whatever poetic ends. In fact, landscape in Stephens has a twofold historical specificity, as a certain type of culturally marked geography, as well as a certain vocabulary field of specific and culturally marked place names. But I will argue in this first moment that Stephens must repress this specificity, whose recognition would at once deflect his work into directions like those of Williams and Olson, and raise social and historical issues that would at once undermine his remarkably self-contained or autonomous aesthetic vision. The repression of the social origins of this neutralized landscape, henceforth given as a kind of abstract vocabulary, a set of neutral counters for the exercise of poetic speech, not unlike those formal, geometrical vocabulary units of the great architectural modernists, such as Le Corbusier, is determined by the subject-object framework of Stephens' poetic practice, which we will characterize as rigorously epistemological in all the worst senses of the word. In Stephens, we never have anything but an abstract subject contemplating an object world, which is thereby construed as being equally abstract. As with the great illustrations of classical epistemology in professional philosophy, where impoverished tokens from the external world, a desk, say, are drawn in as sheer indifferent examples, the items of the external world must, in Stephens, equally be laundered of their cultural and social semantics, just as the social world and the existence of other people must equally be bracketed. But this observation is not a solution, but a problem in its own right. It should logically lead to the attempt to establish the historical preconditions of even this peculiarly abstract possibility. Indeed, the preliminary remarks on Stephens should not over-hastily, in our present historicist and historicizing context, be taken as criticisms, not even yet as an ideological critique of Stephens' work. We do not even yet, for one thing, know exactly what it is or does within that framework. At best, these must be seen as contradictions that will set ultimate limits for Stephens' achievement, and these will be indicated in time. What is historically significant, however, is the work that is done within those limits. That it is avant-garde or elitist poetry goes without saying. But such extreme language experiments have themselves much to tell us about historical possibilities that one would not have been able to read off other kinds of texts. The latter may well be revealing in quite different ways, for which Stevens, or vanguard modernism, would be quite useless. In particular, however, as damaging as the restriction to an epistemological framework may be, we must here too immediately add the qualification that somehow, again in ways that remain to be determined, Stevens' poetry manages to transcend the limits of traditional epistemology. Here, as in the gradual foregrounding of the theme of language in his work, he may best be read as registering a process analogous to that we will observe in French structuralism, namely a dissolution of the older epistemological subject-object framework, which is bought at the cost of a certain reification of language. The well-known problem of beginnings, or of the starting point, now imposes itself. We will begin with the phenomenon of the ease of speech that has already been mentioned. It is not a particularly unusual starting point. Wordsworth critics, for example, find their privileged points of departure in the distinction of moments in which poetic speech can flow from others which somehow block the latter and cause poetic language to return upon itself and interrogate its own conditions of productivity. Meanwhile, in other kinds of poets, the arbitrariness of certain poetic stances, the personal voice, say, or the prophetic mode, or the dramatic monologue, at once, by their very artificiality, designate the central problem of a more general blockage of other forms of poetic language. What we have to do with Stevens is artificially to reconstruct a certain stance or mental element that, once determined, accounts for the seemingly effortless coming into being of sentences and of their content. This may perhaps best be evoked by a contrast with the contemporaneous speech source of surrealist poetry, which lay claim to an equally effortless flow, although one of a clearly very different type. The problem is essentially one of distracting oneself from everything which intimidates or blocks speech. The surrealists found such an ideal locus of spontaneity through the systematic blocking off of conscious, rational, calculating, mental, and institutionalized thinking. In other words, by systematically suspending the reality and performance principle on the order of free association in Freudian analysis. But this very complex mental operation required them, in effect, by their very effort and attention to that reality principle that has to be repressed, to preserve what they cancelled, so that the latter, or better still the inaugural opposition between common sense prose reality and poetic language, returns on the poetic language, which, effortless in principle, at least for the poetic producer, is then wildly dissonant for the reader, and bears all the marks of the bracketing of reality that instituted it. Nothing of the sort, as we have said, for Stevens' form of what may still in some way be characterized as free association. If so, then we would have to speak of something like a free association of pre-conscious material in Stevens, to distinguish him sharply and radically from the surrealists. The more appropriate point of reference, as we shall see, and one that anchors Stevens more firmly in our period than has hitherto been done, is with Levi Strauss's discovery of Pensée Sauvage, of the operation of great pre-conscious grids and associative systems, which, like a language or like several linguistic systems, subtend the thoughts of primitive peoples, that is, of tribal people who have not yet known abstraction in the modern or scientific sense, who precede the emergence of philosophy in ancient Greece. The indeterminacy in Levi Strauss, marked by our designation of such systems as being like languages, is not merely present in Stevens also. It marks out an ambiguous space that is the precondition of the ease of his discourse, namely a kind of no man's land in which words and images are not yet radically distinguished from one another. In any case, as has been widely observed, this ambiguity is at the very heart of the pseudo-concept of the image as well, about which it is never clear whether this word designates the thing of which the image is a representation, or the representation itself. The moment of structuralist reflexivity, in which language itself as a separate system is disengaged from all of its contents, whether images or things, signifieds or reference, is a later moment, which will in fact cancel this initial moment of possibility. The latter is thus available only on condition that the systemic levels and their dynamics are not yet differentiated, a sense of the systemic relationship of words, which is not yet distinguished from a system of images, itself still naively able to be assumed to be a system of the objects themselves, the subsystems of the natural world, or what we have called Stevens' landscapes. Morning and afternoon are clasped together, and north and south are an intrinsic couple, a sun and rain a plural, like two lovers that walk away as one in the greenest body. Notes toward a supreme fiction. These differential relationships have not yet been dogmatically codified in terms of the binary opposition of structural linguistics. If north and south offer such a binary opposition in its pure state, the same cannot be said for morning and afternoon, elements of a larger system ultimately organized around morning and evening, but eccentric to that opposition, and even more so for sun and rain, in which these secondary, or marginal, or asymmetrical oppositions have been widened to include quite different seams, before being returned to the more conventional sexual opposition, the lovers, and revealed to be the unity of growth by means of the adjective greenest. No yoking of widely disparate contents in a jarring surrealist image here. There seems to be little enough resistance to the play of the mind across these signifying fields, and their reunification is a victory that is not bought at any particularly exorbitant or even visible cost. The still point from which this kind of systemic exploration, this free association of the pre-conscious, is possible, will then be initially one of cultural systems and collective associations, socially institutionalized in the collective pensée sauvage, as in Levi-Strauss. It may be useful to mark the cross-reference to another significant modernist literary discovery, namely Flaubert's sudden awareness of the operation of bits of material language in consciousness, the not yet completely determinate yet ominous organization of the mind by clichés, commonplaces, forms of bêtises which are active in crystallized or reified phrases and bits of material speech. Only where in Flaubert these foreign bodies are immediately felt to be degraded speech, and through Bouverisme already prophetically linked to the nascent media, the vehicles of propagation of these pseudo-thoughts, in Stevens there is no particular sense that these associative paths are in any way inauthentic. The same is true for Levi-Strauss, but for a different reason, namely the restriction of his work to tribal peoples before the fall, objects in his Rousseau revival of the celebration of something like natural man. Yet this is what accounts for the peculiar impersonality of Stevens' poetry and imagination. No sense of the urgent need to forge a private and uniquely personal style, to wrest one's individual pensée sauvage as an act of revolt from the standardized culture surrounding those last places of the authentic. Stevens' imagination situates itself at once in the universal, thereby forfeiting the peculiar glamour of the modernist poet as poète maudit, genius and unique stylist. Style being, above all, the ambiguous and historical category in which, in high modernism, the specificity of the individual subject is expressed, manifested, and preserved. This peculiarly unmodern commitment to collective association, to an already systemic cultural storehouse, a commitment that does not in Stevens involve the renunciation of the personal and the private, either, since in a sense it precedes the very emergence of the individual subject and of the latter's oppositions, accounts in another way for what we have called the hollowness or impoverishment of his content. Utopian in that it implicitly insists on the undegradedness of the cultural stereotypes, on their freshness, and perhaps indeed their immediate or unmediated relationship to nature itself. The reliance on collective automatisms in a fallen society cannot but constitute somehow, at some ultimate level, the 0 degree or average common denominator of a fragmented and atomized Gesellschaft. Hence the strategic limitation of this material to landscape, where those features may be expected to be least obvious and intrusive. Still, there is much properly cultural material in Stevens, material that dates him oddly far more than the other great modernists of his generation, and read in a certain fashion obsessively evokes the glossy ads, the Art Deco, the fashions and interior design of the 1920s, or the more elegant productions of the silent movie era. When the elephants here in the park, shriveled in frost, and the leaves on the paths ran like rats, your lamplight fell on shining pillows of sea shades and sky shades, like umbrellas in Java. T. Yet the high luxury of these characteristic interiors is a significant mechanism in the dynamics of Stevens' associative systems. These materials are allowed entrance to the verse, not because Stevens is particularly aware of their social and class character, as rather because, for obvious class reasons, they are felt in their elegance to be something like a subset of the natural. As in contemporary photorealism, people, debutantes, jazz age, rakes, Newport aristocracy, and the like, are excluded, and only the utopian locus of a peculiarly refined space for life remains behind, as also in some advertising. In fact, of course, such images are not natural, but form a specific signifying field, among others in Stevens' imagination. Others, related in different ways, would include the popular American field of associations. Whitman, the emperor of ice cream. American birds, Indian imagery, a whole-marked American vocabulary that intersects with various other specific vocabulary fields, such as the French and so forth. But what is important to us at present is the return of this seemingly alien content to the baseline natural system. This is achieved by means of a slippage from image to language, the glossy ad for an elegant boudoir, the luxurious empty place of reclining bodies, negligées, intimate receptions, now without any apparent discontinuity or shifting of gears, finds fulfillment in an unexpected way by the emergence of a place name, Java. Indeed, place names in Stevens, he who travelled so little in his life and was proud of the fact, play a key role in the transformation of systems of natural or landscape images into more properly linguistic systems. The mystery of place names, like those of proper names generally, lies in their coordination of a general cultural system. See Levi Strauss on the naming system for dogs, cats, birds, and horses in our culture, with the unique dyactic of the here and now, the named individual who is incomparable and presumably not systematizable. In Stevens, the place name will be at one and the same time the very locus and occasion for a production of images. Quasi-Flaubertian Bavarisme, the daydream about the exotic place, the free association on Java, Tehentepec, Key West, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Yucatan, Carolina, and so forth. And the emergence of another level of systematicity in language itself, the generation of place names out of each other, their association now as a proper vocabulary field, behind which yet a deeper system is concealed and active. That deeper system, as the majority of place names in Stevens can testify, centers on the exoticism of the South, and most notably of the whole Caribbean area. Stevens was also proud, in particular, of never having been to Europe, a set of place names that would have been peculiarly intrusive here, as we shall see in a moment. We may thus generally characterize this new and very instinctive signifying field as corresponding generally to what would today be called the material of the Third World, yet another reason why there is some deeper logic in including Stevens in the movement of the early 1960s. Only Crane, of the great American modernists, was also sensitive to the specificity of this material, royal palm or the seascapes. But Crane's aesthetics are very different from this, and the resonance of his Caribbean has nothing in common with Stevens' assimilation of third world realities to a place name system and an occasion for infinite imagining reverie. Yet it is clearly a peculiar view of the third world, which one might seek to concretize by the experience of the world tour, the liner cruise through the islands, a peculiarly disengaged luxury tourist's contemplative contact with ports and maps, a specific moment, one would think, of aristocratic or moneyed tourism in the 1920s, which has little socially in common with the more universal tourism of the present day. This impoverished experience reconfirms our notion of the underlying, purely epistemological stance of Stevens' work, a detached subject contemplating a static object in a suspension of praxis or even rootedness, and is documented in Stevens' one autobiographical novel, or narrative, The Comedian as the Letter C. Yet if this is the phenomenological experience, the social equivalent of Stevens' fascination with place names, it also betrays a far deeper social and economic source, which is that of the consumption of luxury products and objects at a particular moment in the development of modern capitalism, and reflects, one might say, a kind of luxury, mercantilist Weltanschauung, a view of the world system as so many sources for expensive imported goods. There is, in other words, a subterranean relationship between the umbrella in Java, the fantasy of the exotic holiday, and the umbrella from Java, the luxury item whose own capacity to generate images, daydreams, and semic associations lies in its origins in a distant place and culture, and in the momentary function of a third world handicraft industry to produce just such objects of consumption for the first world. What we have called the third world material in Stephens is thus not some mere private aberration in his work, not some mere adjunct due to the accidents of his personal history, his means, travel, and the culture of the age, but is rather a fundamental piece in the overall system, the way by which the latter comes to know a global closure and thus a universality, both Hartford and Yucatan, both first and third worlds, on which its other procedures depend. At the same time, by means of this crucial mediation of third world material, a bridge is made between image and word by means of place names, and a transformation of purely social and cultural objects, the interiors, the furnishings, the jazz age, luxury items, back into nature and virtual landscape, since they all come to be associated with exotic places. With the completion of his world by such third world material, then, it would seem that an autonomous or semi-autonomous space has been achieved that can now be felt to represent the real world in its fundamental oppositions, nature versus culture, or in other words, landscape versus luxury consumption objects, and first world versus third world. The next step in our inquiry is to investigate the process of autonomization by which this new ideal world of representation is felt to separate itself from the empirical one. But we must first dispel the impression that this ideal sphere of images and words is some Parmenidean place of changelessness or of static being. Our characterization of the content of Stephens' world as hollow or impoverished designated the nature of the link between the ideal and the empirical in Stephens. On the other hand, once we enter completely the realm of the poem, it is clear that there is a great fluidity, a wealth of movement and micro-event that must now be accounted for in some more adequate fashion. We have suggested that the space of possibility onto which Stephens' imagination, for whatever accidents of personal history or inclination happened, that space which unexpectedly opens up a seemingly limitless movement of poetic discourse without barriers in all directions, this space is essentially that designated by structuralism or by theory as the symbolic order, or in a different way by Hegel as objective spirit, or by Durkheim as collective consciousness. That is, the ensemble of representations, representational systems, and their various levels, concepts, images, words, in which the individual consciousness or subject must dwell, and about which the thinkers of this period increasingly suspect that, more than a mere element for thought, or even constellations floating in the mind, this whole system may in fact determine and program individual consciousness to a far greater degree than had hitherto been imagined. This discovery, if it can really be called that, is significantly contemporaneous with the emergence of media society, or of the Société de Consommation, and may thus be expected at least in part to register this tremendous quantitative increase in material images and representations of all kinds in the new cultural space in question. Always accepting the conception of a symbolic order as a kind of space and dynamic beyond the individual subject, we do not, however, necessarily need to endorse the various models and hypotheses devised by high structuralism to describe this new space, and essentially extrapolated from linguistic systems, binary oppositions, the Greimas semantic rectangle, even the more multidimensional projections of a Levi-Strauss or a Foucault, of immense systemic relations in constant transformation. Stephens' freedom to move within the symbolic order is at least in part ensured by the absence of such codified models, which often restrict inquiry or exploration in advance. Now that Stephens' work is over and complete, it would certainly seem possible to imagine an enlarged and complex structural analysis capable of mapping it out after the fact. Here we will essentially be content to stress the multiplicity of subsystems in this ideal space, which is closed, if at all, only in the sense that the Einsteinian universe is closed, by folding back on itself, such that one never meets anything but contents of the same order, rather than, as in traditional closure, by the arrival at limits beyond which some radical otherness or difference from the system is felt to exist. These subsystems, or fields as I prefer to call them, are thus in themselves capable of infinite expansion and combination. The dominant one, what in another kind of writer one would have been tempted to call that of the pastiche of Elizabethan language, what I have earlier characterized as the rediscovery, in a modernizing world of styles, of an essentially rhetorical practice in Stephens, this field is capable of as much formal variety, of as unlimited a mutability, as clouds themselves, to use a characteristic Stephens image. And one could, in a pinch, dwell in it forever, were it not for the perpetually nagging sense that it is not itself really a world, but merely a specific language. Each of these fields is thus essentially complete, with its own oppositions and its own rich possibilities of dissonance and contradiction. In such a field, for example, grammarians can be gloomy, and still wearing golden crowns. Such eventful tensions are felt to be an interesting heterogeneity only within the limits of the field itself. When, as we are admonished to do by the letter G, we step outside that particular stylistic field, such variety once again falls back into a kind of homogeneity. What has to be added, however, is the observation that there is also a play of eventfulness, of dissonance, of contradiction and variety, or heterogeneity, at the intersections between the various fields, as when a pseudo-Elizabethan vocabulary, for instance, like two galaxies colliding and interpenetrating on their distinct paths through space, momentarily knows interference with the pseudo-American, Whitmanesque, folkloric vocabulary field, all shot through with hoots and barbaric sounds and yawps. These intersystemic combinations ought clearly to produce an even richer sense of eventfulness than those that take place within any given system, all the more so since, as I have suggested, the systems involved are themselves disparate, some being systems of images, some of concepts, and some simply of vocabularies and style. Yet this is not necessarily the case either. What tends to happen when a single subsystem or field intersects with another is rather a bracketing or a distanciation in which each is precisely grasped as a field, seen now for what is an ideal system of representations rather than a world. Here, too, a certain current of structuralism, or rather of its immediate prehistory, coming upon an analogous phenomenon, has proposed a concept for this process which is relevant. This is Barthes' early notion of connotation, derived from Hjelmslev, and later repudiated in Barthes' middle or mature structuralist period. Connotation designated a set of messages given off, not by things themselves, but by the modes of representation of those things. A moment, in other words, in which, to use another characteristic formulation of the period, the medium turns into its own message, or rather begins to emit its own messages, in which the former message or denotation is henceforth only the location or pretext for new second-degree messages couched in the language of signs or styles or representational systems themselves. But Barthes' account, at least in relation to Stephens' poetry, needs to be elaborated and refined. For here it is clear that we have to do not merely with isolated connotations, but with a play between whole systems of connotation among each other, systems in which reference withdraws in order the more surely to foreground style or representation as its new object. In that sense, the concept of connotation would offer yet an alternate model for theorizing the gradual autonomization of Stephens' systems, their reorganization into some ideal sphere beyond the empirical world itself. Thus, even this form of intersystemic play, as open-ended, clearly, as is each of the systems itself, ultimately undergoes an autoreferential momentum in which its very content, at the latter's strongest, ends up rather designating a play of forms. With this, we may begin to observe the dynamics of autonomization proper as they can be viewed within the small-scale model or experimental laboratory situation of this poetic language. Just as my fingers on these keys make music, so the selfsame sounds on my spirit make a music too. Peter Quince at the clavier. It is the quintessential Kantian moment in which, as contemporary middle-class subjectivity is forced back inside its own head, the idea of the thing peels off the thing itself, now forever out of reach. Lest, to be sure, as a Kantian noumenon than as an infinitely receding referent image, separating from the thing, idea from image, word from idea, so that as the poem systematically drives itself deeper and deeper into the symbolic order, the absent cause of its content appears at ever greater distance in the imagined cosmos, its final symbolic form, that absolute referent, as Derrida has called it, the sun, in which, in some ultimate quintessence, all reference becomes itself concentrated and reduced to a point, a pure locus without dimension. The sun no longer shares our works. Not to be part of the sun, to stand remote and call it merciful. The strings are cold on the blue guitar. The man with the blue guitar. But this absolute referent was always present in various guises in the earlier poems, most strikingly perhaps in that remarkable exercise, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, in a form Stevens virtually invented for modern poetry, the theme and variations, where the referent is first the intense black point of the eye of the blackbird, only to return in various forms of punctuation and interference within consciousness, as the shadow cast by the real. This is the most crucial moment in Stevens' poetic operation, the unresolvable contradiction on which the whole system turns and depends absolutely. Reference must be preserved at the same time that it is bracketed, and that it is affirmed of it that it can never be known, that it stands outside the system. The system autonomizes itself as a microcosm, a self-contained, faithful utopian reflection and representation of things as they are. But in order to assure its continuing autonomy, it must retain the link with the real, of which it is the Hegelian inverted world, or the complete mirror reflection. This link with the real, what we will shortly characterize as the link between the autonomized sign, signifier, signified, and the referent, cannot within this system be theorized. We are therefore given two absolute and incommensurable, self-contradictory formulations. On the one hand, nothing changed by the blue guitar. Since the space of the symbolic order is the space of the images, ideas, and names of things as they are, the latter persevere serenely in their being, unmodified by their symbolic representation. Nothing changed except the place of things as they are, and only the place as you play them on the blue guitar, placed so beyond the compass of change, perceived in a final atmosphere. Yet the opposite is also true, and its affirmation is equally necessary to the poetic system, namely that in some utopian sense everything is changed by the supreme fiction of the symbolic order. Here is then once again the great paradox of the symbolic order thus conceived. It is both ideological and utopian, both a simple reflection or projection of the real with all its contradictions, and a small-scale model or utopian microcosm of the real in which the latter can be changed or modified. One is reminded of Kenneth Burke's characterization of the ambiguity of the symbolic act and the cultural generally. On the one hand, a merely symbolic act which is not praxis and which changes nothing, yet on the other a genuine symbolic act which has at least the symbolic value of genuine praxis. My point is that both of these contradictory formulations serve a non-theoretical function, namely to preserve the parallelism between a semi-autonomous symbolic space and the space of reality. This is a functional necessity for Stevens' system, since, as we shall see shortly, when in postmodernism the referent vanishes altogether, with it go the properly symbolic possibilities of Stevens' own specific subject-object relationship. Yet from this necessity, which Stevens must hold in being, which he must not allow to proceed further along the momentum of a properly postmodernist disintegration, a certain number of consequences flow, some of them ideologies, or strategies of ideological containment, in order to keep this contradictory system under control, and some of them inevitable structural results and limits of the system itself. Among these, that very quality of Stevens' poetry which we posed as an initial problem, namely the ambiguous sense of richness and impoverishment. We will formulate these structural consequences under three headings, with the preliminary reminder that the dialectic outlined up to this point is not ideological and does not yet imply the ideological critique of Stevens' work about to be summarized. Up till now, what we've described is an objective experience of a certain capacity of language, or the symbolic, which for whatever personal accident Stevens felt himself impelled to explore, of which he made himself the objective vehicle, or recording apparatus. The symbolic space opened up by Stevens' work, the autonomization of image from thing, idea from image, name from idea, is in itself neither true nor false, neither scientific nor ideological. It is an experience, and a historical experience at that, and not a theory about language or a choice susceptible of ethical or political judgment. But given the instability of this experience, which needs to be safeguarded and perpetuated by various strategies, the ideological now makes its appearance as what the formalists would have called the motivation of the device. The strong form of ideology taken in Stevens' work is what we have since come to identify, in the most general sense, as existentialism, including within it that fiction-making thematics of Nietzsche's work, which is its initial moment. Here the familiar and banal motifs of Geworfenheit and absurdity make their predictable appearance. The death of God, the disappearance of religion, now determine a radically meaningless world in which alone poetry or fiction can restore at least an appearance of meaning, assuming for the moderns the function that religion used to secure in more traditional social systems. The earth, for us, is flat and bare. There are no shadows. Poetry, exceeding music, must take the place of empty heaven and its hymns. Ourselves in poetry must take their place, even in the chattering of your guitar. This ideology is then systematically elaborated and produced in the poems on death and the religion of art, from the early Sunday morning on, in what are surely for us today the least interesting parts of the Stevens canon. Yet what must be insisted on is the innate instability of existentialism, understood here as an ideology rather than as a technical and rigorous form of philosophical discourse. For as soon as we come to be convinced of the fictionality of meaning, the whole operation loses its interest. Philosophies of as if are notoriously unsatisfying and self-unraveling. Yet when such an ideology unravels, then the very conception of fiction disappears along with it. In order to prevent this dissolution of the poetic system, something like an absolute fiction must be desperately maintained. But to impose is not to discover. To discover an order as of a season, to discover summer and know it. To discover winter and know it well, to find, not to impose, not to have reasoned at all, out of nothing to have come on major weather. It is possible, possible, possible. It must be possible. It must be that in time the real will from its crude compoundings come, seeming at first a beast disgorged, unlike, warmed by a desperate milk. To find the real, to be stripped of every fiction except one, the fiction of an absolute. Angel, be silent in your luminous cloud, and hear the luminous melody of proper sound. Notes toward a supreme fiction. Here, then, the ultimate referent is affirmed by the very movement that denies it, and what is less an ideology than a desperate conceptual prestidigitation reaffirms the impossible, the silent angel, the absent cause, the absolute or necessary fiction. Yet, in a final moment, this desperate systemic readjustment has practical consequences which are like the price to be paid for its continuing existence. This is the great lateral movement of autoreferentiality referred to in the beginning, in which the act of designating the absent referent, Blackbird's eye, or the sun itself, the impossible angel, turns out at one and the same time to be a process of designating the symbolic or poetic space in question as symbolic or poetic, as fictional, such that the poetry will now come to turn on itself and, in all of its rotations, continue to designate nothing but itself. Hence the richness and impoverishment we speak of. Infinitely rich as the projection of a whole world, a whole geography, this language at once empties itself by calling attention to its own hollowness as that which is merely the image of the thing, and not the thing itself. Yet at this point, at which Stephens would be indistinguishable from the autoreferentiality of high modernism generally, an unusual permutation takes place, and a new thing, theory itself, emerges. What before was merely poetic discourse, with its traditional and banal problems of the nature of specifically poetic discourse, and of the aesthetic as non-practical and non-cognitive, suddenly opens up into a new form of discourse, which is theoretical and poetic all at once, in which the theory of poetry becomes at one with the life of poetry. Yet this emergence marks the originality of Stephens, now considered as a moment of the 1960s, a moment in which poetry also, in its traditional sense, dies and is transformed into something historically new, something that will gradually, in opposition to philosophy or literature alike, come simply to be designated as theory. It is the end of art, perhaps, in the Hegelian sense, but also its realization and its transformation into the sphere of culture generally, or of the symbolic order.